My next guest is Ammie Kessem, Vice President of the Northwest Side GOP and 41st Ward Committeeman. We'll have to have her back to talk about politics and all those kind of things, because today she's here to put context around the topic of policing. Sergeant in police force, been on the job for years. She can talk about her time and background, but this is a little different. You've listened to other shows about policing, and it's usually some official representative, or it's someone talking about policy and that kind of thing. No, this is just a real conversation to kind of like, like we did when we were little and used to talk to Officer Friendly. This is just, a casual understanding about what they go through, what things have changed, what people don't pay attention to, and what they don't may not even realize is an issue. So I'd like to welcome Ammie to the show.
Hi, Charles. Thank you so much for having me on.
Glad to have you. It's good to talk to you. And I don't know where we should start. I guess I should start with some realities about working as a police officer that you may think that people either don't know or is not given enough attention.
Well, one of the things that we spoke about in the past is how, unfortunately, too many people watch too much TV and movies, and it's just not the reality of the situation.
You don't go around shooting guns out of hands, is what you're saying.
Yeah, or in the leg or the foot, those kinds of things. Not on purpose, anyways.
Oh man, that is funny. We did talk about that because obviously, even though she's here on the radio, it's not like it's our first conversation. And we talk about, joking about how it must be so hard for police officers to watch their jobs being portrayed in movies and TV, and we joke about it, but a lot of people get their ideas and their perception of police, good and bad, from what they see on TV, right? So the culture plays a large part in everything. That's what I talk about a lot. So if we see one police officer take out 8 people, when you struggle to take out 2, we think you're kind of weak, Ammie. Why didn't you? I mean, it was only 2 of them. The guy on TV had like 9. That plays a part, the shooting angle and all that kind of stuff. So, and part of it, I guess I'd have to ask, in reality, it's just really not that exciting all the time, right?
Yeah, in reality, most police officers in their careers, 30 years of police career, have never shot their weapon. That's just the reality. So
they go 30, I'm just trying to do the math here. So they go 20 to 30 years as police officers, and they've never fired their weapon, but half of them have killed a black man. So, I mean, I'm writing this calculation on the whiteboard, and it's just not coming out, right? Because the perception is all you do is go around, trying to find, black people and then shooting at them. So if they haven't fired the weapon, then what are they doing all day then? That's
most of the time they're just patrolling the neighborhoods, making sure that things are safe. If even things like if their cars are broken down in the middle of the street, they stand by to make sure that they're safe during that time. We're here to help. We're not here to hurt people.
And I, like I mentioned to you, I know a lot of police officers, and there's a few of them I talk to on a fairly regular basis. And I was having a conversation with someone. We were going back and forth about interactions, because in my book, I wrote about there may be obviously problem police officers, and some even precincts that may have a problem that need to be fixed. Nothing's perfect, but this overarching theme that all cops are. It's literally a thing, right? ACAB, that all cops are, it doesn't mean bad, but I'll go with bad. And that, you can lump them all in together. And, I talk about solutions a lot on the show. And I say, well, if you want a solution, you need to step back and find the actual root of the problem. And so when you're exaggerating things, you can't fix it. So in the book, I was talking about interactions. So I said, okay, so a lot of times you hear people who try to defend police, I don't think they go far enough, and they'll say there's only this many people. You see it all the time. Only 10 people, unarmed men, were shot. Only 50, only 100 people got shot. 1,000 people, Washington Post. I said, but it's like, incomplete calculations. You need to put it in perspective. And what I say is, how many police officers or people with police powers do we have across the country? So you take that number, and most of them, you would assume, are working full time, right? So how many interactions do you think each of them have, and collectively, how many interactions? And I said it's like 1 billion interactions. And people are like, where are you coming up with this massive number? I said, well, what do you define an interaction? Right? You think an interaction is pulling a guy over on the side of the road for speeding and walking up to that car and having that conversation. That is an interaction. But isn't it, though, also an interaction if you're a uniformed officer when you walk into McDonald's on your lunch break, right? And someone walks up to you, or the person at the counter is extra friendly to you because they love cops, or if they're mean to you because they don't like cops, it's still an interaction. So you're wearing your uniform and everyone can see it. So every time you encounter a person, isn't that an interaction?
Yeah, you can dissect words when it comes to policing. I mean, even just the topic of defunding the police. You said about defending the police. Well, let's talk about defunding the police and what that terminology means, to people is much different. Some people believe that the defunding of the police is reducing their budgets, less police officers. But in reality, it's really more about redistributing funding from the police and focusing it more towards, social issues. And, one of the realities of the situation is that social workers are just not equipped to deal with serious situations that police officers are dealing with on the street. And then the other reality is that police officers are not equipped to deal with serious social worker issues. Right, there has to be some discussion on where we can help in that situation.
Well, I wish it were that nice, but I would argue, and in my upcoming book, I talk about that. I deep dive into this movement, and you will find that that's window dressing. They really want to abolish the police. They say they want to defund to minimize the budget, and they say they want to redirect funds. Some of them do, but there's a hardcore center of these organizations that want nothing to do with police at all. They just want them gone. They want to police their neighborhoods themselves, which we both know is bad, against the law, and it won't work. But that's what they want. But when you talk about, we're going to come up to a break soon, and we can, obviously go into it further. But when you talk about defunding the police, whatever it means, there are dangers to it, right? Let's talk about some of the things that defunding the police, some of the problems that will come up from that. Like you had one, you talked about recruitment. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure police departments all across the country right now are having a really difficult time finding people that actually want to do the job. It's when you hear a constant, demoralizing message from media and on social media in regards to the police and how people feel about them. Who wants to do that job? I mean, it's very difficult to find people these days that are willing to put their families on the line, their reputations on the line, and have to deal with that every single day of their life, coming home to their families after having that message being sent through the media. But the reality is, though, Charles, and we can talk about this after the break, that that's a false narrative that the media is actually portraying. And there's polling that shows, and we can get into all of that. There's polling that shows that police are overwhelmingly supported by citizens.
Oh, yeah. You mean that it's a false narrative that most people have negative perceptions of the police?
Correct.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. It's the simple take of people listening to the squeaky wheel. So, yeah. I mean, it's hard not to. You can't ignore, 100 people walking down the street saying, I hate the police on the same day in 20 cities. I mean, it's kind of hard to act like it didn't happen. But we don't look at that and say, well, 100 people in 20 cities is 2,000 people. Yeah. In a country of 300 plus million people.
Sure. and one of the things that I wanted to bring up during this interview was that back in April, now mind you, this was before the George Floyd.
The music playing, hold that thought. And we're going to do a pre-George and post-George. We are discussing policing with Ammie Kessem, VP of the Northwest Side GOP. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
He's gone.
We return to the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine? Do you yawn
Welcome
when they
back.
speak
We
of
are
sunny Spain?
discussing policing with Ammie Kessem, Vice President of the Northwest Side GOP, 41st Ward Committeeman, and Police Sergeant. And when we left, I think you were going to tell us something that happened back in April?
Yeah, so we were discussing, post George Floyd, pre George Floyd incident. And first of all, most police officers, all police officers that I've ever spoken to in regards to the George Floyd incident believe that that incident should have never happened. That the reaction of those officers was just wrong. I don't know any police officer that would have said otherwise. That being said, before that incident happened, the former president of the FOP, Lodge 7, commissioned a poll from Ogden and Fry. Basically, they were trying to find out if the public supported hazard pay for COVID. But in that poll, it was very interesting because the questions that were asked was, whether or not the citizens of Chicago had a favorable or somewhat favorable opinion of the police department. And 59% had a favorable or somewhat favorable opinion, as opposed to 32% had a somewhat or very unfavorable opinion. But then when we break it down even more, which you kind of touched on, in regards to Black Americans, 62% said that they had a favorable or somewhat favorable opinion of the police, as opposed to only 27% that said unfavorable or very unfavorable. Break that down to when we look at, there was a movement post George Floyd incident to remove police officers from the high schools in Chicago, and the board voted in favor of keeping them in the schools, and that was based off of what the parents said that they wanted for their children. So these are very interesting, topics to discuss. People, in general, do support the police. Unfortunately, the media tries to tell us otherwise.
Yeah, and I will give you one more drill down. This is a non-scientific poll. I didn't go to Ogden and Fry. I went to all the Black people I've known in over 40 years. I know some, but look, you're like this one. I know some people who don't have favorable opinions of police, right? Black people, 30 to 50 years old, they've had bad experiences, or they just don't have positive experiences with police. Guess what percentage of them want to defund the police? Take a guess.
I'd say about 20.
Zero.
Wow.
0% of them. None of them. Not one. None. Zero. Did you catch that?
Wow.
I don't like police, but I'm not stupid enough to think they should be defunded. That's their response. So even further than your 62%, even the people who are like, I'm not a fan. I'm not going out to the police, to celebrate them and going to the police parade, but I'm not crazy enough to think these streets would be safer without them. You got to see, people need to understand that not only are they listening to the squeaky wheel, but they're listening to, 19-year-old, soft college students who've never been outside a bubble before. What society have decided that these are the people that should make the decisions on what's going on? They don't know enough. They haven't experienced enough. And when you see, I've seen a lot of these marches up close, like walk through them, get caught in them, whatever. 80%, now granted it's where I was, but 80% of the people were white, and the Black people were like, between, 17 and 22. So these are the people I'm going to understand how to fix a problem, but that's the I talk about the culture a lot, and that's what the culture is now. It's like, let's listen to the youth. Let's let 14-year-olds vote. Let's see what the 13-year-old from Sweden has to say about climate change. I don't care what you think about climate change. I'm just saying don't ask the 13-year-old. Right. So,
Right.
you can take that back to your other officers, and I think they'll be shocked by that.
Sure.
Because they may have a negative opinion doesn't mean they're stupid. That's one. But we were also talking about defunding, and you talked about recruitment. But I would say not every way, but I try to give people their argument. So I say that maybe they got good intentions, and they just think, I don't know, they think the problem is worse than it really is, which is part of the problem. But they want to fix it. And they're like, all right, we defund the police. And they're doing it because the police are, quote unquote, committing large scale acts of police brutality. But we know that's not true. But if I give them the argument, it's okay, police are committing all these acts of police brutality. You want to fix it. So your solution is to defund the police. But my argument is logic portends that may cause more brutality. And what I say is not everyone, but, police departments across the country are different. But in some areas, police work with partners, right? So, and this is going to lead to down the road when we talk about, the argument that you don't report bad police. We'll get to that in the next segment. But so I'm a police officer and I have bad tendencies, let's say. Right? Or I'm just not that good of a cop. But I got my partner to rely on to strengthen me, and together as a unit, we're good. Well, you defund, now they can afford to have us ride together. And I'm not an officer, but I got a little bit of common sense. Doesn't that mean that when I now ride alone, I am more likely to act on those negative impulses that I was less likely to do because somebody was there with me? Now that I'm alone, I'm more likely to do it. Or if I'm the bad officer who's not racist or anything, I'm just not that good, and now I'm stuck by myself, I may use force sooner than I would have if someone else was there.
Well, yeah, that is actually a big reality in policing is, responding to jobs when you don't have enough backup. It absolutely could lead to people's reaction not being the proper one or not being a safer one, right? Because as we know, there's strength in numbers. Mm-hmm. And criminals know this. Yep. They know, if there's less police officers on the street, that their help isn't coming, and they could potentially get away with more or harming the officers, or and then that puts the officers in a very precarious situation as well, right?
Yeah. I don't know how often you listen, but I talk a lot about, I've interviewed people from different spectrums of the criminal justice reform movement. And I always open their eyes because I say when we start with criminal justice reform, some of it I think is needed, some I don't. But the problem is when we start with that conversation, we need to start with crime. Because no one ever talks about crime, right? Think about what you hear. Correct me if I'm wrong. You live in this. But when people talk about criminal justice reform, they talk about cops, good or bad. I'm going to defend them. I don't like them. Whatever. Cops. They talk about prison, good or bad. We need to lock more people up. We need to lock fewer people up. We need to lock more people up for this and less people for that. Fine. We can have that discussion. But do you notice what's conspicuously missing from this conversation? They never talk about the criminal. They never talk about bad behavior. They never talk about the guy who's been arrested 17 times. So he's the same as the guy that's been arrested once. He's proving to you that he's not going to stop doing whatever it is he does. But to say that is foreboding. So, I just don't understand how we think we're going to solve the problem. If we won't even mention the elephant in the room, as Dave said earlier, the elephant in the room is people commit crime. They do. Right. And so somebody needs to do something. Now, the order, when you talk about the legal system and what you want to do with that, how long people should be sentenced and what should be thrown into that consideration, that's fine. But at some point, when someone's violent, we need to agree that they need to be off the street.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We live in very strange times right now, especially, with COVID and everything. Keeping people locked up for petty things is just not happening because they don't want these individuals to contract COVID. I get that. I think most people get that. But when you have hardened criminals who are out there and they're being charged with, attempt murder or even murder, and they're out on ankle bracelets, that's a problem, Right. So that's something that needs to be addressed, and we need to hold our criminals accountable for their actions.
Yeah, and I don't know how often it's happening there anymore, but I know here in New York, it's like nonstop. They talk about all over the country about how crime is up here. but it's always repeat offenses. It's always somebody who just got out for COVID or just was on parole or just was doing it. It always is nonstop, and no one really wants to talk about that problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And,
so, I mean, we can't fix anything if we don't talk about that.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't truly understand the people that they elect are the ones who are responsible for making these decisions. And when they elect people that don't hold criminals accountable, that's the problem, right?
Yep, without a doubt. Well, coming up on the other side, we will talk more with you about that. And I want to get a little bit further into post-George Floyd policing. We're talking to Ammie Kessem, Vice President of the Northwest Side GOP. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing policing with Ammie Kessem, Vice President of Northwest Side GOP, 41st Ward Committeeman, and Police Sergeant. I wanted to go back to discuss briefly what's happened since George Floyd, but I did have I want to address something you mentioned before the break. You were talking about COVID and how you understand that people should not be in jail. Most of us understand that they shouldn't be in jail for these small offenses, but when you talk about violent criminals, it's different, which is true. But when we talk about the narrative out there and what the media does and what some people do and what those people in those crazy groups like Blantifa push, they push a false narrative because it creates emotion in people and it moves them. And one of the things they have people believe, and I hear it all the time, is they honestly think that people are in jail. Most of the people in jail, the vast majority of people in jail, even federal offenses, are for small things. So when you talk about, drug reform, and they're like, well, this war on drug didn't work. True. And so we need to do something about people because we can't just have a bunch of people locked up for, smoking a joint. They act like even if we just narrowed it to drugs, they act as if the average person who's in jail on a drug offense was smoking a joint on their back porch and the police went and snatched them off their porch. So we have a lot of people who believe that that the people in jail and the police are going around rounding people up for these small offenses. And if that's what they believe, of course they think negative things. So I just wanted to say that and say that, there are a lot of hardened criminals and repeated criminals in jail, repeat offenders, and we need to, acknowledge that and not think that they're all in for, traffic violations or something. But
that was one of the things that President Trump addressed, actually, in his administration with the First Step Act. That addressed that issue. And as we saw, I can't remember the woman's name, the grandmother that had been locked up.
Alice Mae Johnson.
Yes. I mean, what an incredible story, right? A perfect example of someone who should be given a second chance at life.
Mm-hmm. Angela Stanton King. Yeah, there's been several. I think somebody else just got released here. But it's true. It's just, but obviously there's a lot of people in jail who deserve a second chance, and I don't have a problem with that at all. But we can't pretend that they're all innocent either. It's like there's an essay from 1619 Project that talks about criminal justice, and it's like 1,500 words, and there's no criminals in it. Nobody in the whole thing had broken the law. So we're still buying this thing that there's 2 million people in jail and none of them broke the law. I mean, we have to be serious about it. We can still help them. We shouldn't throw them away, but we shouldn't act like they're innocent either.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. They need to also be given the proper tools in order to turn their lives around. And it's obviously all of that costs money, and people understand that. And I think that that's one of the things when we do talk about defunding the police, that terminology, I hate that term. I absolutely hate it because it pins citizens against the police. And right. I think that there's definitely a different phrase that we can use to try and possibly, I don't know, if redistributing funding is the right the right option either, but we
Nope.
need to address the issues at hand. We need to make sure that people have the proper tools to be able to turn their lives around, that people have mental health services that they need. All of these things it's all encompassing when you talk about police work and how citizens can better themselves.
Yeah, and I would argue that no rephrasing of the term makes sense. You need more money, not less money. But briefly, I want to ask you what changes you've seen since the George Floyd death in your day-to-day job.
I think that there's a lot of conversation in regards to training and how departments across the nation are conducting their training. We have the consent decree here in Chicago that is addressing training issues. But ultimately, that situation, like I said, I don't know a single police officer that would have felt that situation was handled correctly. Not a single one.
But do you have people that are more combative?
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, but do you experience people being more combative or antagonistic towards you?
I have to be careful about speaking about my personal experiences while with working on the street with my department. I'm not really allowed to talk about that, but I would say if you speak to officers across the country, as I have, I think many of them will tell you that there are more people that are more adversarial with them and feel that they can treat them with a different, higher level of disrespect because of that situation. And we have to get people back to a scenario where the public feels that they can go to the police and talk to the police, and there's a mutual respect there for each other.
Right. All right. So coming up, we'll just talk more about these problems and possible solutions with Ammie Kessem, VP of the Northwest Side GOP. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing policing with Ammie Kessem, the Vice President of Northwest Side GOP. And before the break, Ammie, you spoke about some officers experiencing negative sentiment from people that, kind of increased since George Floyd's death. And I want to say that I know some people who will say that they signed up for that, which to me is laughable, because you can say that police officers sign up to deal with dangerous situations, but not to be hated, right? And targeted or things of that nature, or just be, yelled at for no reason, which is what happens in some places. And I think that a lot of this, you talked about the media a couple of times, but a lot of it has also been brought on by, I assume well-intentioned, but politicians. Like, it's become, political in a way, where they, I know it's happened here in New York, where, there was an altercation with a police officer, or maybe someone shot somebody. I think it wasn't even a shooting. Most of them have been like, protests, complaints, and things of that nature. And the mayor would just have a press conference and say that cop was wrong, right? Or just say, what else seeing the facts, like anything else, cop could be wrong, may not be wrong, but it's just this race to be like, no, I'm on your side, and I'm going to, I want that cop fired or suspended, or, I'm going to do this, that, or the other. So do you think that the job has also been, in general, made more complicated when it becomes political? Did I lose you? Oh, maybe I ran her away. But I'll let Pete try to see if he can find her. But I see that in some situations where people, I would imagine that if you're going about doing your job, and if you've been on the job 10, 15, 20 years and you were doing your job and doing it well, and everything was, the same, you did it the way you normally did it, and then all of a sudden it's like now everything is being called into question and put on the news of, in front of a camera. And I think I would assume that would take a toll. So, Amy, did you hear my question?
I did. Sorry about that, Charles. Yeah, I definitely think that these politicians are playing into media sensationalizations of these incidences, trying to get support from the voters, and very quick to judge on both ends. But like I said before, we have to find a level of mutual respect between the citizens and the police. We have to do a better job of upholding human dignity, which
right.
I think that more departments are trying to discuss with their officers and doing that. And we also have to realize that police officers are human beings. We're not robots. We have families. We have, we are everyday citizens that have to go out there, and most police officers that I know didn't take the job just to get a paycheck. They took the job because ultimately they wanted to help their fellow man and woman. And one of the things that I love is like these citizen academies where individual citizens go and do a few days a week or so in police academies, and they really learn on an individual basis how difficult the job is, and how a lot of times these officers are thrust into situations and have to make split-second decisions. Right. And unfortunately, because we are human, we're not robots. Sometimes those decisions, things could have been handled better or differently, and that's when we go back to training and dissect situations and say, okay, what can we do better for the citizen?
Right. Yeah, those are awesome. I want to shout out to my friend Jeannie Kruger. She's done one of those, and she loves them, and she helps run them for other people who want to come in and do it. And it's a great way to learn more about policing, and like you say, get a better understanding of what you do and what you go through. Obviously, the thing that everyone wants to talk about is, police being bad, and I think they have a weird view on what makes a bad cop. I think that obviously someone who's racist or violent and roughing everybody up or shooting someone, would be considered a bad cop. But, I think that there's more nuance to it, and there's more gray areas, and they look at it like, they look at it from an extreme, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I think that, like I said, going back to training situations, I think that more departments are looking at not rushing their officers to get through these situations and having them take more time with people in situations and really trying to be more understanding and not being so quick to make a judgment or, just, quickly finishing one job and moving on to the next, I think. And that's going to be a problem, too, when you talk about defunding the police. If you want officers to spend more time to, make sure that they're making the right decisions when they're responding to their calls, well, defunding the police is not going to allow that to happen.
That is true. And we will talk about some solutions or try to come up with some on the other side with our last segment with Ammie Kessem. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You make me feel so sweet.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. Our final segment with Ammie Kessem, Vice President of the Northwest Side GOP, 41st Ward Committeeman, and Police Sergeant. And Ammie, you were talking about training, which is obviously important, but people need to understand, I think, that being in these high stress situations is different than normal life, anything that we all experience, but also different than training. And obviously, that's why training is repetitive and ongoing. So you get that muscle memory and things of that nature. But some of these people in these situations, it's as simple as, they haven't been in that situation before, or it's been a long time since they have been, or something similar, and the training kicks in, and sometimes it doesn't kick in, and that's a problem. But we can't just simplify it and look at it like, well, obviously they did that because of lack of training or whatever, and it makes it more complicated. And think about that from our side as a citizen. So I asked, what can we do? I know that police departments across the country are scrambling to find ways to improve their relationship with the communities, but it's a two-way street. And many of the people who are making all the noise aren't willing to come to the table. In fact, many of the reformers who go to these politicians and say defund, other things, they make demands, they don't even want police part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
What do we do?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, it's not an easy answer, especially in the world of COVID. When it comes to police training, a lot of times, I have 22 years as a police officer. I still find myself in situations where it's just completely baffling that, and things I haven't ever had to deal with before. It comes at you so quickly, and you have to make these decisions. And just, the COVID situation kind of limits the training right now for officers that are newer to the job, are in the academy currently. It definitely limits their ability to do proper training. So these are all things that are going to have to be taken into consideration in the world that we live in today. How do we get these officers to have the proper experience to respond to the citizens and their needs in the world of COVID is a pretty interesting topic of discussion. Right?
Well, let's see if we have any suggestions here. We have Bill on line one. Bill, you talk about a need for qualified teachers?
Yeah, what the problem is? They have people who are politically connected or going out with a higher-upper who ends up teaching at the academy. They have no qualifications to teach. They have no experience on the street, but because they knew the right person, they get the cush job down there at the academy. And all they do is injure these officers because they don't train them the right way.
So it sounds like every other. Thanks, Bill. It sounds like every other situation where. Yeah, every other situation where you talk about the right people not being in those positions. And Lewis, quickly, you say that defund equals accountability?
Yes, I say defund needs to be termed accountability, because in Chicago they have like incidents where they have these raids going on, and they had them going on TV where they call them mistakes, and those are not mistakes. Those are incompetent people, who are ill trained, and they don't know the policy that goes along with apprehending a fugitive, and they're not following the policies.
Well, thanks, Lewis. But the question on a lot of these in those situations, thanks, Lewis and Bill, is who, even if it is incompetence, it's who is incompetent. Is it the officers on the ground because everybody blames them because that's who they see? But somebody's making the call. So the problem is everybody said, well, that guy went into that door and he was wrong, like the woman in Louisville. But someone sent them there. So you have to look at the whole and not just the people, the scapegoat was easy to go to. But Ammie, I want to thank you for coming on and giving us some context around policing, and hope to have you back on politics.
Thank you so much, Charles. It was a pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful new year.
Thank you. You too.